Hey guys, tonight we're not walking into a glamorous medieval banquet with goblets and lutes. Nope, we're walking face first into a smell so powerful it could knock a modern city bus off its route. Welcome to the medieval city, where the stench isn't a detail, it's the main character. Before you get comfy, dim the lights, grab a blanket, and maybe light a candle. Actually, scratch that. Medieval candles were made of tallow, aka beef fat, and they smelled like rancid meat. So, unless you want eau de slaughterhouse filling your room, maybe just stick with your vanilla, scented IK special. Now picture this, you've travelled to 14th century Paris. You're expecting romance, Gothic architecture, maybe some troubadours strumming a lute. Instead, the first thing you notice is that your nose has filed for immediate divorce. The entire street smells like a landfill hosting a petting zoo, with a hint of dead fish for flavour. The roads, forget cobblestone charm. They're basically medieval smoothies, equal parts rainwater, horse crap, pig crap, human crap, and oh look, yesterday's rotting turnips. Hope you brought boots, because you're about to learn what Uncle Deep Regret feels like. And the animals? Everywhere. Chickens running through markets. Goats tied up to staircases. Pigs waddling around like they own the place. They didn't just live with people, they were roommates. And not the good kind. The kind that never cleans the bathroom, eats all your food, and also poops in the hallway. Here's the thing, nobody thought this was unusual. This was just Tuesday. People went about their business like the city wasn't actively trying to choke them. And there was no escape. Rich or poor, noble or peasant. Everyone was breathing in the same thick medieval air, heavily seasoned with butcher blood, tanner's chemicals, chamber pot juice, and optimism that died weeks ago. So yeah, welcome to medieval urban life. Forget fairy tales. Forget knights in shining armour. The only thing shining here is the puddle outside your door, and you pray it's just water. Tonight, as we explore the disgusting reality of these cities, just remember when you flush your toilet later, whisper a little thank you to modern plumbing. Because back then, the toilet was the street. Ready, hold your nose. Let's dive in. There's an old saying, cleanliness is next to godliness. Medieval Europe clearly never got that memo. In fact, if you tried pitching it to a 14th century villager, they'd probably look at you like you'd just suggested licking a rat for good luck. Here's the shocking twist. Early on, bathing wasn't the enemy. In the early Middle Ages, monasteries had bathhouses. Roman traditions of soaking in warm water stuck around like that one relative who refuses to leave after dinner. For a hot second, people thought scrubbing themselves was actually healthy. Imagine that. But then, something changed. Somewhere along the way, water went from healing to hazardous. The science. A medieval remix of paranoia and bad guesses. People thought hot water opened your pores, which meant disease could just waltz right in. You weren't washing away filth. You were basically turning yourself into a sponge for death. Picture it. The Black Death rolls into town, and you're sitting in a nice steamy tub thinking, wow, this feels great. Medieval logic. Congratulations. You've just invited plague germs to your pool party. Bathhouses didn't help their case either. At first, they were community spots where you could relax, steam, and gossip. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, many had the same reputation as a sketchy nightclub at 3 a.m. They weren't just for hygiene anymore. They were for hygiene plus extras. And nothing screams moral collapse to medieval church leaders like nudity, warm water, and people having fun. So the church stepped in and said bathing to sin. And in medieval Europe, if the church said sin, you listened. Result: whole cities slowly gave up on full body bathing. Not because they loved being filthy, but because staying dirty was considered safer, holier, and less likely to get you exorcised. That doesn't mean people just strutted around like dirt-encrusted goblins. They still washed hands, faces, and feet with cloths and herbs, but a proper full soak, that was rare, reserved for the wealthy, the desperate, or the tragically itchy. So, when you imagine medieval life, don't picture sparkling bathhouses with marble floors. Picture a world where water was suspicious, soap was harsh, and cleanliness was something you did in bits and pieces. If you smelled nice, it wasn't because you were clean. It was because you dabbed vinegar on your armpits and prayed nobody noticed. In short, medieval folks didn't skip the bath because they were lazy. They skipped it because they genuinely thought God preferred them smelly. Once upon a time, before Europe smelled like a wet dog that died in a turnip cart, bathhouses were the place to be. They were the medieval version of Starbucks. Everyone went there. Everyone gossiped there, and you never left smelling the way you hoped you would. Bathhouses started with good intentions. Roman influence lingered. Monasteries kept them running, and folks could actually soak, steam, and scrub. Imagine a medieval spa day, your neighbours, and some lukewarm water that hopefully hadn't seen too many butts before yours. But then things got steamy, and not in the herbal relaxation way. By the 13th century, bathhouses were offering more than hot water, massages, food, music, and optional companionship. Suddenly, your innocent soak turned into something closer to an adult's only hot tub party. Families might go in together, sure, but you never knew if the guy in the next tub was there for a rinse or a rendezvous. And let's be honest, when you pack a bunch of half-naked people into a tub with weak lighting, weak morals, and wine flowing, things happen. The bathhouse became the medieval version of Vegas. What happens in the tub stays in the tub, unless you catch something you can't wash off. Of course, the church noticed. Nothing killed a party faster than a bishop glaring at you. They declared that bathhouses were dens of sin, nudity, and disease. And they weren't wrong. By then, you were just as likely to leave with lice as with enlightenment. Throw in the Black Death, and paranoia skyrocketed. Suddenly, bathhouses weren't just sinful. They were plague incubators. So one by one they shut down. Some were boarded up. Some were repurposed into bakeries. Ironic. Yesterday's hot tub was tomorrow's bread oven. And some were simply abandoned, left to rot while people congratulated themselves for being holier and smellier. Bathhouses went from health hubs to scandalous gossip pits to public enemy number one. The dream of communal cleanliness died, and in its place rose the golden age of the sponge bath. Or, as I like to call it, medieval dry shampoo. So yes, bathhouses fell. Not because people hated soaking, but because morality, paranoia, and terrible science killed the vibe. Next time you walk into a spa and complain about the towel service, remember, at least you're not sharing the tub with 6 sweaty strangers, and a priest outside calling you a sinner. In the Middle Ages, danger didn't just lurk in dark alleys or plague pits. No, sometimes it was waiting for you in a nice warm bath. That's right, taking a soak was considered hazardous. Forget sword fights or jests, your biggest risk was stepping into a tub of water. Why? Because medieval science was basically improv comedy with a dash of panic. The theory went like this: hot water opened your pores, and once your pores were open, disease could just stroll in like it owned the place. Bathing during a plague outbreak? Congratulations. You've turned your body into an Airbnb for death. The logic snowballed. Bath too often, they said, and your body weakens, your spirit weakens, your willpower weakens. Suddenly, you're not clean. You're practically inviting demons in for a jacuzzi session. Even the church backed this paranoia. Being naked in warm water wasn't just risky for your health, it was risky for your soul. Because nothing screams sin quite like a man in a bathtub with a loofah. So instead of relaxing in a nice soak, people began avoiding baths altogether. Staying dirty wasn't laziness, it was strategy. In their minds, grime was armor, a crusty protective shield against invisible enemies. Think of it as medieval hand sanitizer, except it was just filth. That didn't mean everyone walked around looking like mud statues. People still wiped their hands, faces and feet. They dabbed themselves with vinegar or rosewater, like the world's saddest perfume commercial. But a proper full-body soak? Rare, risky, practically suicidal. And for the wealthy, who still indulged in tubs, they weren't bathing, they were gambling. The stakes weren't poker chips, it was their immune system. Rich nobles sat in steaming wooden barrels, surrounded by servants pouring hot water and herbs, while silently wondering if this was the day they died smelling like lavender. So yes, medieval people feared bathing. Not because they were stupid, but because the medical advice of the day basically boiled down to stay dirty, stay safe. Unfortunately, without germ theory or plumbing, dirty wasn't protection. It was just dirty. The result? A world where smelling like a goat wasn't embarrassing. It was a badge of honor. Because hey, at least you weren't weakening your pores. Not everyone gave up on bathing. The rich, as usual, played by their own rules. And if you were wealthy in medieval Europe, you could still take a bath, though it wasn't the kind of relaxing spa day you're imagining. No marble tiles, no cucumber slices, no calming whale song playlist. More like a giant wooden bucket in your bedroom, a tub of boiling stew water, and a servant judging you silently while you marinate. Here's how it worked. First, servants lugged in cauldrons of hot water. Not from the tap, mind you. Plumbing was still a couple centuries away. No, this was back, breaking manual labour. Picture a butler staggering in with a bucket of steaming water, praying he doesn't spill it on your silk rug, because that's coming out of his paycheck. Next, they'd pour it into a large wooden tub, sometimes lined with linen, and then, to really elevate the vibe, they'd sprinkle in herbs. Lavender, sage, rosemary sounds nice, right? Wrong. Congratulations, you're now sitting in medieval soup, a chunky stew of water, herbs, and your own sweat. Bon appetit. Privacy. Optional. Your bath was often set up right in the middle of your bedroom, in full view of your spouse, kids, and whatever servant drew the short straw that day. Nothing screams, or romance, quite like making eye contact with your partner, while floating in each other's filth like fondue gone wrong. Some nobles even shared tubs with guests. Because what's more bonding than soaking in the same questionable water with your lord, your lady, and maybe the family dog wandering by for a sip? It was part hygiene, part social event, and 100% awkward. The poor, of course, had no such luxury. Their baths involved dunking themselves in rivers, barrels, or puddles that hadn't yet frozen solid. Efficiency was the goal. Wash yourself, your shirt, and maybe your goat in one go. The goat usually came out cleaner than you did. So yes, the wealthy still bathed. But don't be fooled. These weren't glamorous cleansing rituals. They were half cooking session, half peep show, and one sneeze away from pneumonia. At best, you came out smelling faintly of sage. At worst, you came out smelling like wet lumber and regret. Still, if you had servants' herbs, and a big enough tub, you got to enjoy the one thing peasants couldn't: the luxury of pretending you were clean. If you were poor, and spoiler alert, most people were, your version of a bath made the noble's herb soup soak look like a 5-star resort. Forget lavender sprigs and steaming tubs. For peasants, bathing was less self-care Sunday, and more try not to freeze to death while rinsing in a bucket. First problem: water. You didn't have a tap. You had a river, a pond, or maybe a barrel that caught rainwater when the gods felt generous. The river was free, sure, but it also doubled as the local sewer, animal drinking trough, an occasional medieval morgue. Nothing says refreshing splash like swimming upstream against yesterday's chamber pot. Bath time wasn't even about hygiene. It was about multitasking. You might hear someone say, well, if I'm dunking the kid, I might as well throw in the shirt and the goat. Efficiency, medieval style. The goat usually complained less than the kid. In summer, a river bath meant splashing around with your neighbours, livestock, and whatever dead fish floated past. In winter, though, forget it. No one was breaking through ice to scrub their pits. You just accept that frostbite was preferable to being slightly less smelly. The strategy became, pretend you're clean, and don't stand downwind. And if you did manage a proper wash, there was no fluffy towel waiting. You got out, shivered violently in the wind, and hoped your crusty wool tunic didn't stick to your damp skin like medieval duct tape. Soap? Huh? Maybe if you were lucky, someone had made a lumpy chunk of lye soap that doubled as paint remover. Otherwise, you were just rubbing yourself with sand, vinegar, or possibly a suspicious-looking rag. So no, peasants weren't strolling around smelling of rosemary and rosewater. They smelled like wet hay manure and despair, with a faint undertone of river sludge. And nobody thought twice about it. After all, if everyone stinks, does anyone really stink? Bathing was a luxury, not a routine. And if you made it through your life with one full soak per season, you were practically a trendsetter. So next time you complain about your shower taking too long to heat up, just remember your medieval peasant ancestor would have killed for that lukewarm drizzle, or at least used it to wash the goat. When full-on bathing became too dangerous, too sinful, or just too damn cold, medieval folks discovered a middle ground, the sponge bath. Except, spoiler alert, there were no sponges, just rags, bits of linen, and whatever liquid you could get your hands on. Picture this: instead of a relaxing soak, you grab a damp cloth, dip it into vinegar or rose water, and dab yourself down like you're basting a turkey. Voiled. Cleanliness. Medieval edition. If you're rich, your rag is dipped in imported rose water. If you're poor, congratulations. You're scrubbing yourself with a cloth soaked in whatever was left in the beer jug. Either way, you smelled not clean, but at least different. And it wasn't just about hygiene. It was about the vibe. Sponge baths were seen as safer, more modest, and less sinful. Because apparently God didn't mind you wiping your pits with vinegar, but he drew the line at a full dunk. Heaven forbid you enjoy yourself in warm water. These wipe downs also came with some creative ingredients, herbal mixes, milk, wine, or even piss. Yep, human or animal. Waste not, want not. Some thought urine had disinfectant powers. Spoiler, it didn't. But hey, if you smell like a goat, why not rub goat pee on yourself to even it out? The wealthy treated sponge baths like a ritual. Servants would carefully dab their lords, and ladies with perfumed cloths, while the poor just wiped whatever they could reach and prayed nobody sniffed too hard. Either way, it wasn't exactly a glow-up. It was more like damage control. And let's be real, sponge baths didn't make you clean. They just rearranged the filth. You'd mask the smell of sweat with the smell of vinegar, cover the scent of manure with lavender. It was basically the medieval version of spraying Febreze on a couch that a dog has already claimed. Still, people swore by it. Better than catching plague in a bathhouse. Better than freezing your bits off in a river. The sponge bath became the compromise. Quick, modest, and only mildly humiliating. So when you hear the phrase, medieval hygiene, don't picture flowing baths and scented oils. Picture a half-naked guy in a drafty room, dabbing himself with a saw rag, muttering, "Good enough." If there's one thing medieval people loved, almost as much as not bathing, it was messing with their hair. Hair was pride, identity, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and being mistaken for a scarecrow. But don't picture silky locks flowing like in a shampoo commercial. Picture greasy straw that smells faintly of barnyard and onions. Now, here's where it gets fun. Medieval shampoo wasn't Pantene, it was egg yolk.
Yep.
Crack an egg on your head, rub it in, and pray no one mistakes you for breakfast. Add some beer for shine, vinegar for cleansing, and maybe rosemary if you're feeling fancy. The result? Hair that probably smelled like salad dressing and an in-floor at 2 a.m. Combing was a big deal too, not just for style, but for survival. Lice and fleas loved medieval scalps like kids love candy, so out came the bone combs, dragging through hair while you muttered curses and collected a small zoo of parasites. Nitpicking wasn't just a phrase, it was an actual family bonding activity. Picture mom, dad, and the kids huddled around the fire, taking turns picking bugs out of each other's hair. Nothing says quality time like sharing a bowl of soup and a bowl of lice. Hairstyles themselves were creative. Nobles loved long and flowing locks to show off status, and how many servants they had to delose them. Monks, of course, rocked the famous tonsure, that little bald patch on top surrounded by a hairy halo. Imagine looking in the mirror and realizing your style inspiration was reverse donut. It was supposed to show piety, but it mostly showed your scalp sunburns. Women plaited, braided, and covered their hair with veils or wimples, partly for fashion, partly to keep it from crawling away. Peasant women, practical braids, usually tied back so the hair didn't dip into the stew pot. Because nothing ruins dinner like finding your own braid floating in the broth. Oh, and let's not forget the flammability factor. With open flames everywhere, hair doused in beer and oil was basically medieval lighter fluid. One spark and, poof, instant fireworks. You weren't just battling lice, you were battling spontaneous combustion. So no, medieval hair wasn't shiny, fragrant, or healthy. It was sticky, buggy, and flammable. But hey, at least it gave them something to complain about while they were busy not bathing. If you've ever skipped brushing your teeth before bed and felt guilty, congratulations. You're already ahead of medieval Europe. Dental hygiene back then was less sparkling smiles and more crumbling ruins. Honestly, you'd have better luck finding a straight tooth on a medieval peasant than finding a clean glass of water. So, how did they try to keep their chompers intact? With the creativity of a drunk inventor. People rubbed their teeth with linen rags dipped in salt, vinegar, or charcoal. Which sounds okay, until you realize salt basically sandblasted the enamel off. Vinegar corroded everything. And charcoal just made you look like you'd chewed on a campfire. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist. Instead, folks chewed twigs. Yep, snap off a branch, gnaw on it, and call it dental care. Sometimes the twigs were flavoured with herbs, so at least you'd die of tooth rot with a hint of mint. And toothpaste. Forget Colgate. A popular medieval recipe was crushed eggshells mixed with honey. Because nothing says minty fresh like smearing calcium dust and bee vomit across your gums. Of course, when all else failed, there were the barbers. Yes, the same guys who cut your hair also yanked out your teeth. Imagine walking in for a trim and leaving with fewer molars. They didn't have anesthesia, just a pair of rusty pliers and a prayer. Tooth hurting. Out it comes. Problem solved, along with half your jawline. The wealthy fared a little better. They had access to imported spices, perfumes, and fancy concoctions to sweeten the breath. But underneath the cinnamon and cloves, still rotting teeth. Rich or poor, nobody escaped the slow march of cavities. Sugar was rare, but bread filled with grit from grinding stones was common. Every bite was like chomping sandpaper. Congratulations, you just gave yourself medieval braces, except instead of straightening your teeth, they just broke them. By middle age, most people were down to a few sad survivors in their mouths. Smiling wasn't a sign of joy, it was a health risk. If you flashed too many gaps, people might assume you were one step away from the grave. So, yeah, medieval smiles weren't dazzling. They were terrifying. Think less Hollywood red carpet, and more Jacko lantern carved by a drunk farmer. Picture this, you step out of your medieval home, take a deep breath of fresh air and immediately regret having lungs. The medieval city wasn't just alive with people, it was alive with smells. Horrible, unholy smells. The kind of smells that make you wish your nose had an off switch. There were no garbage trucks, no sewer systems, and no, sorry for the inconvenience, the street sweeper will be here Tuesday. Instead, people just hurled their waste out of windows with the medieval version of a warning. Gardezaloo! Translation: watch out for the water. Except, spoiler, it wasn't water. If you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, congratulations, you've just been knighted by a flying bucket of pee. Livestock roamed freely too. Cows, goats, chickens, and pigs weren't barn animals, they were neighbourhood roommates. And like all roommates, they left behind little presents all over the street. Combine that with rotting food scraps, dead fish from the market, and the occasional decomposing animal, and you've got a perfume that no candle company will ever bottle. But wait, there's more. Tanneries, the places that processed animal hides, stank so badly that even medieval people, who had the olfactory tolerance of sewer rats, complained about them. They used urine and dung to soften hides. Imagine walking past a leather workshop and wondering if you just stepped into Satan's porta potty. The solution: perfume balls called pomanders. Tiny hollow spheres filled with herbs, spices, or resin, worn around the neck like medieval febres. Fancy people carried them everywhere. Did they work? Kind of. They didn't make the air less disgusting, but they helped convince you that at least your immediate sniff zone was slightly less cursed. And if you think nobles had it better, nope. The castles had guardrobes, are basically medieval toilets that emptied straight down the wall. So the moat, already a mosquito soup, doubled as a sewage lagoon. Romantic, right? Nothing says defend the kingdom like standing knee deep in human soup. The bottom line: medieval streets didn't just smell bad, they smelled committed. A mixture of body odour, waste, smoke, and regret. The kind of smell that tattooed itself onto your soul. You didn't walk through town, you survived it. So, if you're ever time, travelling and step into a medieval city, here's my advice: don't take a deep breath. Take no breaths. Imagine being crammed into a medieval banquet hall. The fire's roaring, the ale is flowing, and everyone's laughing, until the heat kicks in and you realise you're marinating in the combined musk of 50 unwashed bodies. Congratulations, you've just invented eau de desperation. Deodorant, forget it. Antiperspirant, not even in the same galaxy. Sweat wasn't just tolerated, it was practically encouraged. Medieval physicians believed sweating purged bad humours. So if you were drenched and smelly, you weren't gross, you were healthy, which is a convenient way of saying, yes, I reek, but it's medicinal. So what did people do to mask the stench? Well, if you had money, you powdered your pits with alum, chalk, or crushed herbs. Basically medieval talcum powder. If you were poor, you just embraced your inner swamp. Some folks rubbed vinegar under their arms, which worked for about 3 minutes, before you smelled like a salad left out in the sun. Perfume was another option, but it wasn't exactly Chanel No. 5. Sometimes it was made from rose oil, sometimes from musk, sometimes from a gland found in the backside of a small cat, like Creature. Nothing boosts confidence quite like thinking, do I smell better? Or do I just smell like I wiped myself with a ferret? The nobles had perfumed handkerchiefs, which they dramatically hold to their noses while mingling in public. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of walking around with your own scented air filter. Meanwhile, peasants just hoped their neighbours stank worse than they did. And the clothes didn't help. Layers upon layers of wool and linen trapped heat and moisture like a medieval crockpot. You weren't just sweating, you were slow cooking yourself. By the end of the day, peeling off your tunic was like opening a lid on leftover stew. The worst part, everyone was in the same boat. The king stank, the queen stank, the priest stank. Even the saintliest monks smelled like a compost bin in July. Body odour wasn't an exception. It was a community event. So next time you're worried about forgetting deodorant, just be thankful you don't live in a world where smelling like rotten onions was a normal Tuesday. If deodorant was a fantasy, linen was the next best thing. Forget body wash loofahs and 5-step skincare routines. The real MVP of medieval hygiene was underwear. Not lacy Victoria's Secret stuff though. Think scratchy linen shifts and shirts, the kind that could double as a tent if you were desperate. Here's the logic: bathing to dangerous, sinful, possibly fatal, but changing your shirt? Totally fine. So instead of washing their actual bodies, people washed their undergarments. It was like saying, I didn't shower, but I did laundry, so I'm basically clean. Linen was breathable, absorbent, and surprisingly durable. It soaked up sweat, grime, and whatever horrors your medieval armpits were producing, then acted as a sacrificial layer between you and your expensive wool tunic. In short, your undershirt was taking one for the team. And status. Oh yeah, linen was basically the Gucci of hygiene. A white, freshly laundered shift meant you had your life together. A grey, crusty one meant you were either poor, possessed, or possibly halfway to the grave. People literally judged you by your laundry. Forget Instagram aesthetics. Clean underwear was your medieval brand. But washing linen wasn't exactly a spa experience. It involved boiling water, lye soap, beating the fabric on rocks, and praying the river didn't wash your only shirt downstream. And the smell. Let's just say, when your detergent is urine. Spring fresh isn't happening. Still, it was better than letting your tunic sprout a new ecosystem. Knights wore linen under their armour to avoid turning into roasted ham. Monks wore it under their habits. Peasants wore patched-up scraps, and nobles had entire closets of the stuff. Changing your linen twice a week was basically saintly behaviour. So no, medieval people weren't walking around totally filthy all the time. They had a system. A gross, sweaty, occasionally mouldy system, but a system nonetheless. Moral of the story? Linen didn't just save clothes, it saved reputations. And probably marriages. If there was one thing medieval cities guaranteed besides mud and questionable owl, it was free pets. Not dogs, not cats, lice, fleas, mites. Congratulations. You didn't choose them, they chose you. Everyone had them. Nobles, peasants, monks, queens. Lice were the great medieval equalizer. You didn't catch them. You just coexisted, like roommates who never paid rent. combs were the weapon of choice. Tiny, fine, toothed combs carved from bone or wood. Imagine spending hours raking your scalp like a potato field, pulling out wriggling little freeloaders. Romantic, right? If Netflix existed back then, lice, picking date night, would have been the top trending show. Clothes weren't safe either. Boiling or baking garments by the fire was standard pest control. Sure, you might kill the fleas, but you also risked setting your only tunic ablaze. Nothing like standing half naked in January while your shirt turns into medieval barbecue. And if you really wanted to nuke the problem, shave it all off. Soldiers sometimes did it. But even then, wigs and hoods quickly became new bug hotels. It was basically pest relocation, not extermination. Fleas, meanwhile, weren't just annoying. They were deadly. These little suckers carried the Black Death. That's right. Your itchy ankles weren't just irritating. They were possibly lethal. One bite and boom, half of Europe was gone. And here you are scratching thinking, maybe it's just hay fever. Herbal sachets stuffed in bedding, tried it. Smoke fumigation, tried that too. Reality check, the fleas didn't care. They went where the blood was, and the blood was you. In short, medieval life meant living with a constant, skin-crawling itch. Forget skin care routines. This was a full, time battle against bugs that always won. The only relief, knowing everyone else was scratching just as miserably as you were. So yeah, next time you complain about one mosquito bite, just remember, your medieval alter ego was basically a walking buffet with no bug spray. Forget going to the bathroom. In medieval cities, you went wherever the situation allowed. A guardrobe in a castle, sure. A pit behind the barn, also yes. Out the window? Oh, absolutely. Bonus points if you shouted, "Guard Lou!" before unleashing hell on some unlucky pedestrian below. Castles had their version of luxury bathrooms. Guardrabes. Sounds fancy, right? Nope. It was just a hole in a stone bench that dropped straight down into a pit, or into the moat. Romantic dinner by the castle moat? Not when it's also doubling as the septic tank. Peasants didn't even get that much. Most handled their business in the woods, the fields, or wherever the smell was least noticeable. Communal pits existed too, which meant squatting next to your neighbour while he complained about crop yields. Privacy. Never heard of her. But the real MVP of medieval sanitation was the chamber pot. Everyone had one. Imagine waking up at 2 a.m, fumbling in the dark, and doing your business into a cold ceramic bowl right next to your snoring family. Glamorous, right? The next morning, that pot's contents were ceremoniously tossed into the street below. If you're walking through town and smell something funky, congratulations, you've just stepped into medieval plumbing. And toilet paper? Not a chance. Most straw, rags, or, if you were feeling buggy, a scrap of wool. Winter bonus snow? That's right, a frosty medieval bedit straight from nature itself. City sanitation was creative. Gutters and open ditches carried waste away when they weren't clogged and overflowing like a poop smoothie. Sometimes pigs roamed the streets, eating garbage and cleaning up. Imagine relying on farm animals to manage your public health system. So the next time you complain about your bathroom being out of toilet paper, remember, at least you're not hanging your butt over a hole in the wall. Praying gravity and God are on your side. Once upon a time, before everyone collectively decided water was suspicious, medieval bathhouses were booming. Think of them as the spas of the Middle Ages. Hot tubs, steam rooms, massages and snacks. Sounds relaxing, right? Well, give it a couple centuries and suddenly they're less wellness retreat and more medieval Tinder with plumbing. At their best. Bathhouses were community hubs. Families could go together, monks could soak side by side, and merchants could relax after a long day of haggling over cabbages. Picture a medieval YMCA minus the yoga mats, but by the 13th century, things got steamy. Bathhouses picked up reputations for offering extra services. You'd go in for a rinse and come out with gossip, a lover or an infection. Basically, what happens in the tub doesn't stay in the tub. Naturally, the church lost its mind. Public nudity was already a big no-no. Add in rumours of sin and scandal, and bathhouses were suddenly branded as brothels with loofahs. Then came the Black Death. Doctors thought warm water opened pores, which let in disease. Translation: if you bathe, You're basically turning yourself into a sponge for death. Not the best marketing slogan. The result: bathhouses got shut down left and right. Some were abandoned, others turned into bakeries, which, honestly, is the funniest glow down in history. Come for the sin, stay for the sardo. In southern Europe, a few bathhouses limped along, mixing steam rooms with herbal treatments. But in northern Europe, bathhouses vanished faster than your dignity slipping into a tub full of strangers. Suddenly, scrubbing was out, dabbing with vinegar cloths was in. So, next time you light a candle, pour a bubble bath, and sip wine while soaking. Remember that your medieval ancestors would have considered that both sinful and medically suicidal. You know how today's soaps come in colours like Ocean Breeze or Lavender Vanilla Bliss? Yeah, medieval soap was more like burnt pig fat with a hint of campfire and regret. The classic recipe: animal fat tlalaiais, basically wood ash water. Stir that together, let it harden, and congratulations, you've made a cleaning product that doubles as medieval napalm. Sure, it could strip dirt off your tunic. It could also strip half your skin. Most people didn't even bother putting it on their bodies, unless it was a special occasion. Weddings, court appearances, or maybe if you survived the plague and wanted to celebrate with a good scrub. Otherwise, soap was for laundry and dishes. You didn't lather, rinse, repeat. You cry, burn and regret. There were luxury versions though. Down in southern Europe, fancy soaps from Spain and the Islamic world made with olive oil were gentler and actually smelled decent. Castile soap was the gold standard, smooth, less caustic, and proof that not all soap had to feel like chemical warfare. If you were rich enough to buy it, you probably didn't smell like death all the time, just most of the time. Meanwhile, the average peasant used whatever lump of pig, fat brick they could get their hands on. Forget a skincare routine. Soap was more likely to make you look like you'd been through a small house fire. So, yeah, medieval soap technically worked. But worked in the same way a sledgehammer works to open a peanut. Effective, sure. Gentle, absolutely not. Doing laundry in the Middle Ages wasn't a chore. It was a full contact sport. Forget tossing clothes in a machine and pressing. Quick wash. Medieval people hauled shirts to the river, soaked them in lye or urine, yes, actual pee, known as chamber lye, and then beat the fabric against rocks until either the stains came out or the shirt gave up on life. Picture it. Washwomen lined up by the river, smacking clothes like they were boyfriends who forgot anniversaries. The sound alone must have echoed through the village like a medieval drum circle. Except instead of chanting, it was mostly cursing and arm cramps. The smell, atrocious, soaking clothes in ammonia, rich pee meant laundry day reeked like a cross between a public outhouse and a brewery accident. But hey, it worked. Sort of. Once scrubbed, clothes were rinsed in the same river that doubled as a sewer, animal bath, and medieval trash can. Fresh was a relative term. If your tunic didn't crawl away on its own afterward, you called it a win. Drying wasn't fancy either. Shirts and linens were draped over bushes, hedges, or just thrown onto the nearest fence. Villages ended up looking like medieval yard sales, where everything smelled faintly of sheep and shame. But here's the twist. Clean clothes were more important than clean bodies. You could stink to high heaven, but if your line and shift looked bright, people assumed you were respectable. Basically, laundry was medieval deodorant. So the next time you complain about your washing machine eating a sock, remember your ancestors were elbow deep in piss water, praying their only shirt didn't float away downstream. Take a deep breath. Actually, don't. You wouldn't survive a single inhale in a medieval city. Forget fresh mountain air or new car smell. This was fish guts, pig poop, and someone else's chamber pot contents baking in the sun. Walking through town was like entering a nose-based obstacle course. The fish market smacked you with rotting seafood. The butcher's stall hit you with blood and bone stew. Then you passed the tanner's shop, where animal hides soaked in urine until they smelled like Satan's own perfume. And don't forget the open sewers, gutters that carried waste down the street when they weren't clogged into stinking lagoons. Add in pig herds rooting around, dogs fighting over bones, and the occasional dead horse in the corner. And you've basically got a medieval version of Febreze called Just Hold Your Breath. But people didn't just tolerate it, they accessorized. Enter the pomander, a little ball filled with herbs and spices, worn around your neck like a medieval air freshener. Think of it as carrying around your own scented candle, except it did nothing but politely scream over the filth. Nobles dabbed perfumes too, some floral, some musky, and some harvested from the glands of very confused animals. Eau de weasel butt, anyone, and yes, body odor joined the symphony. Everyone was sweaty, layered in wool, and unbothered by deodorant's non-existence. Walking through a medieval crowd was like being front row at a concert. Only the band was garlic, feet, and despair. But here's the kicker: nobody complained. Why? Because everyone smelled? Rich, poor, saint, sinner? It didn't matter. Stench wasn't an insult. It was a community project. So next time you wrinkle your nose at a crowded subway, just be grateful you're not dodging poop from above while marinating in eau de medieval city. If you can't fix the smell, distract from it. That was the entire medieval philosophy on hygiene. Forget actually cleaning. Just toss some herbs in your shirt and hope no one notices you smell like boiled goat. Perfume existed, but it wasn't exactly Chanel. Sometimes it was rose oil, sometimes it was musk, and sometimes it was harvested from the backside glands of a small cat-like creature. Nothing screams confidence like dabbing your wrists with essence of ferret butt. Nobles carried pomanders, fancy little metal balls stuffed with cloves, cinnamon or lavender. They wore them around their necks like medieval AirPods, but instead of playing music, they just yelled over the stench of sewage. Think of it as a portable Glade plug, in only less effective. The ladies got creative. Scented sachets were sewn into dresses, turning every hug into a potpourri explosion. Some even braided rosemary or marjoram directly into their hair, which sounds classy until you realize you've basically turned yourself into a walking salad. Meanwhile, the poor made do with whatever was available: crushed mint, vinegar, maybe a wildflower if you were feeling fancy. You didn't smell good, but at least you smelled like something other than onions and sweat. And here's the kicker: perfume wasn't just about covering stink. People thought nice smells literally fought off disease. If the plague rolled into town, your pomander wasn't just an accessory, it was a medieval gas mask. Spoiler, it didn't work. But at least you died smelling faintly of lavender. So, yes, medieval perfume was less about seduction and more about survival. Next time you spray cologne before a date, just be thankful it's not musk ripped from a very confused animal. If medieval people flashed you a smile, you probably flinched. Dental care was less Colgate Fresh and more hope my teeth don't fall out before dinner. Toothbrushes, not a thing. Toothpaste. Sort of, if you consider ground up eggshells, oyster shells, or charcoal mixed with honey, paste. Imagine smearing gravel on your teeth and calling it progress. Whitening strips? Oh, sweet summer child. These people were just trying to keep their molars from staging a walkout. The standard routine was a linen rag dipped in salt or ash and rubbed across your teeth. Effective. Kind of comfortable. About as much fun as sanding wood with your face. Some used chewing sticks. Twigs frayed at the end. Congratulations. You've invented the world's first organic toothbrush, and it tastes like bark. Breath fresheners existed, too. Fennel seeds, cloves, cardamom if you were fancy. If you weren't, you just hoped everyone else's breath was worse. Wine or vinegar rinses were also common. Yes, gargling vinegar was considered refreshing. Nothing says, kiss me, like reeking of pickled onions. Dentists, if you can even call them that, were usually barbers moonlighting as tooth yankers. Got a cavity. Too bad. Infection. Out comes the tooth. Anesthetic. Hilarious. The only thing numbing you was sheer terror, and maybe a pint of vial. Aftercare. Spit wine on it and pray. Here's the plot twist, though many medieval people actually had decent teeth compared to modern times. Why? No refined sugar. Their smiles may have been crooked and a little mossy, but they weren't inhaling candy bars or soda. Still, when rot did happen, it was brutal, and the only cure was a very sharp pair of pliers. So yeah, medieval smiles weren't exactly dazzling. More like functional if you squint. Next time you brush with minty foam, remember, you could have been chewing sticks and gargling vinegar. while a barber sharpened his pliers behind you. So after 20 chapters of sweat, stink, fleas, and flying chamber pots, let's ask the big question. Did medieval hygiene actually work? Short answer, sort of. Here's the thing by modern standards. Medieval folks were walking biohazards. They smelled like onions marinated in goat juice. Their teeth were cleaned with twigs. Their deodorant was vinegar, and their plumbing solution was to scream, "Look out below," while dumping poop on strangers. Not exactly peak sanitation, and yet they survived. Not all of them, obviously shout out to the Black Death, but enough to keep Europe going. Their tricks, Lenin shifts, herbal rinses, vinegar dabs, lice combs, were something flawed, absolutely, but better than nothing. Kind of like using duct tape to hold a car together. It rattles, it squeaks, but hey, it gets you to the next village. Some of their ideas were surprisingly smart. Linen layers really did help with hygiene. Vinegar has antibacterial properties. Herbs like rosemary and sage weren't useless. They weren't completely clueless. They just lacked, germ theory, soap that didn't feel like acid, and toilets that didn't double as medieval water balloons. So what's the verdict? Medieval hygiene wasn't about smelling good or sparkling clean. It was about looking respectable enough to not get eyed at church, surviving long enough to harvest turnips, and avoiding death by open sewer. Next time you step out of a hot shower, teeth brushed, deodorant on, and fresh clothes straight from the dryer, maybe whisper a quiet "thank you" to the centuries of smelly ancestors who crawled so you could Febreze. Because compared to them, you're not just clean, you're practically a god.